Yes. Thank you very much for being here, and well done for making it. I think it's each COP has its challenges, and I think this one definitely has one in the finding pavilions. The mood is so happy out there that it's sometimes difficult to open closed doors and get in rooms. So thank you very much for joining us. I guess we switched the coffee machine. Oh yeah. Is our audience online already? Yes, great. So a warm welcome to everyone, both here in Dubai and those who are connecting online. So yesterday I was told by a fellow moderator that there was 3 times as more people online as there were in the room. So I need to behave, because sometimes you realize that it's a cozy group, but it's definitely not Chatham House. So there will be many people connecting, and we will, I guess, have questions. So we'll take the questions after the discussion. Our panel is not entirely here, but one of our panelists is running late, and because Foreign Minister Eide from Norway will need to leave earlier, we will start now. This is not meant to be a long introduction. My name is Grégoire Roos, and I coordinate political strategy at the BMW Foundation. We're based in Germany, and we work on socioeconomic transformation and responsible leadership. And we have been very privileged to partner with the UNFCCC for some years now. And this is a kind of annual flagship discussion we host in their pavilion. And we're very grateful to Gaurav, Linda, and all the team for being so wonderful partners. And we're really happy to be here. I would also like to thank very, very warmly our wonderful panelists. As you can imagine, those 2 distinguished panelists are leading their delegation, spend more time in serious negotiations and not just on panels. I will make sure that this discussion is as serious as possible. So I thank you, both of you, very, very much for taking the time to be with us. As you saw in the title, we want to focus on economic transformation, obviously because, and that will be the open question, that is to some extent the biggest bridge we can see between mitigation and adaptation. We have been hearing a lot over this past few years that there was a kind of drift between those who would say we should focus on mitigation and the others who would say no, but that's too late. Now we're at the stage of adaptation. The truth is one cannot be successfully addressed without taking the other into account. And of course, that's the crux, the heart of the challenge. So we, of course, don't need to remind you that we stand at a crossroads, and although we always try to be as positive as we can in our narrative, we are here in Dubai off track to limit the global warming to 1.5 degrees. So hard work is needed. The question is whether we can find in that economic transformation path opportunity to strengthen economic resilience, create better jobs, local jobs, and ensure regional peace and stability. And this is why I'm really happy to be joined by Foreign Minister Eide. So you have an outstanding track record at the top of Norwegian politics. I guess you've assumed all the biggest portfolios that one could imagine. You were defense minister, foreign minister, minister of environment and climate, and now back as foreign minister. And so that gives you a kind of extremely holistic view on the climate dimension, the economic dimension, the development dimension, but also the security and diplomatic dimension. And with us, the former foreign economy minister of Senegal, of Amadou Hott, who is served as a minister of the economy, planning and international development. His leadership was instrumental in making the presidency of Senegal of the African Union a real success in 2022, if I'm not mistaken. And Minister Hott is now special ambassador and special advisor of the president of the African Development Bank for the Alliance for Green Infrastructure in Africa. Really important portfolio at the African Development Bank, and I'm really happy that we can deep dive into what it means. So I'd like to start with you, Foreign Minister Eide. You were appointed by the President-elect of COP28, Dr. Sultan Al Jaber, as co-facilitator with Minister Fu from Singapore of the ministerial consultations on climate mitigation. So hard work, short nights, as I can imagine. And the issue for you is to seek consensus to raise global ambition, and that's far easier said than done. The question I'd like to ask you is, as I said in the introduction, economic transformation seem to be the best bridge between mitigation and adaptation. And I also stressed that you were now Foreign Minister, but you're also Minister of Environment. So you have that double approach. So can actually economic transformation bridge mitigation and adaptation?
Yes, we have to, because we seriously need to solve the climate crisis as well as the biodiversity crisis, but we also need economic development, and the two are obviously related because they are both imperatives for better life on the planet, but also because it's very hard to convince people that in order to solve the climate crisis you'll be worse off. Yes, things will be different, and we have to do things in a different way, in a smarter way. But we need to have we want also to fulfill the other ambitions of the Sustainable Development Goals. I mean, we want Africa's growth, for instance, but we also want to make sure that, for instance, Africa, since the ADB is represented, just to take that as an example, we both want human progress, better lives, better health, better education, more industrial output, more production, more manufacturing, and compatible with climate change. So you need to see these things related. As I said, both because they're important in themselves, but also because the buy-in is much better if you explain to people that you as a person, you as a worker, you as a society, you as a country will actually be better off through that transition. And then we have to be honest about the fact that as things will change, change always comes with winners and losers. Some people will be better off because they control the technologies, or they sit on the new resources which are more meaningful in the new setting. I mean, if you have a lot of minerals and metals and rare earths that are important for the green transition, you can earn money. But if you're sitting on a lot of oil, you will have less money because of the transition. These are realities. So the thing is, you need to connect this. So you need to have a societal approach with the principle we want to bring everybody on board. And hence, in comes just transition. First, I want to say, I warn against anybody saying, if it's not just, we will not have a transition. We need a transition. But I also want to say the other way around, that if it's not just, it will be hard to get through the transition. And what is just transition? In my view, it is justice in societies, between groups in a country. It's also global justice between different parts, rich and poor parts of the world. But maybe the most important element is justice in time between us who happen to live now and those who will live in the future, whose life will be much worse off if we don't manage our transition. So we need to think all these things into the package, and that requires, I think, a sort of strong whole of society approach to making sure that we set some clear goals, but that we also find out how do we bring people and businesses, companies, societies on board in delivering that change and create some kind of certainty in change for moving to a better. This is easier said than done, but I have to say, I think that as we progress into a more serious conversation of the energy transition, which is what I work on right now, which is a key part of mitigation, I think these aspects are also more and more recognized, that you have also to address these questions on these three levels. So justice in society, justice among countries, and justice over time.
Norway keeps exporting oil and gas to its European partners, and this is obviously a demand from its European neighbors, especially in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. At the same time, the same European neighbors are working hard on decarbonizing, mobilizing capital, changing their infrastructure, and pushing industry to decarbonize. So the question is mitigation actually compatible with economic transformation in the short run?
Yes, we're seeing that Europe is doing a great job, so the EU, with friends, is doing a great job in transforming what we agree as common UN goals in these conferences to daily practice, which also means that you see that entire value chains are now developed, so that for instance, a Norwegian process industry, that aluminium smelter, realizes that they are better off in the market if they have low emissions than high emissions, because there's a premium for low emissions. So for low emissions, so in a sense, we're now seeing a transition from a race to the bottom towards a race to the top, where you have these organized markets. My hope is that we can make those principles more global. that you know, in a perfect world, I would like to have a global carbon price for everyone, so we don't have the discussion between in and out of CBAMs, that, you know, there's a price for everyone. I would like to see that, you know, for instance, to take Africa, I use the example, but it could be anywhere in the global south, but, you know, if you move from just being a raw material producer into more advanced manufacturing, with the abundance of sun, you can use wind power, solar power to produce inexpensive electricity, not sell it to Europe as hydrogen, but actually produce stuff that people will buy. And why would they buy them? Because they're actually produced with lower carbon footprint. So you can lock in a positive trend, but we need to work together to make this happen. And that's why the ADB is a relevant partner in this discussion.
So I'd like to turn to you, Minister Hott. You're at the helm of that Alliance for Green Infrastructure in Africa. I mean, this is massive. We talk about seeking a $10 billion level investment. It was announced earlier this year, the second Dakar Forum, that 69 projects had already been selected. So the question is, how do you select those projects? What's the first deadline? We heard about 2030, which is almost tomorrow, and that matters for the narrative, that the transformation is tangible.
Thank you very much. Great pleasure to be here. First of all, I would like to really agree with what my colleague, the minister, said, especially on the need for Africa to use our renewable energy potential to produce green hydrogen for us and not necessarily for export. I couldn't more than agree. And by the way, we have ties, the same ties roughly, so we are very well connected. Same suit, I think, also. Yeah.
Then you exchange them before leaving.
So we are already like-minded partners. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Exactly. And so you know, that's one of the things that I wanted to say, is that partnership matters and is very important. That's why for the Alliance for Green Infrastructure, we thought that at the AFDB that you cannot hug a baobab. You know, the African baobab is so big that you cannot hug it on your own. You need many people around the baobab to hug it. And African challenges, in particular in greening Africa's infrastructure, is so huge that one institution, one country cannot do it. We set up this alliance 12 months ago at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. Soft launch, 12 months forward. We have now about 8 partners, donor countries, philanthropy, MDBs, and regional development banks in Africa committing an amount that will be announced this afternoon at 5 o'clock at the African Pavilion, where we will sign the financial pledges, and then 2 months later, another large amount will be sort of committed by other partners. The goal is to do 3 things. One is have concessional money, grant money for government to help them do the right planning, the right strategy, the right reforms, because everything starts from the vision, the planning, and having the ambitions to green your economy, and not just to say, I have oil and gas, I have to consume it. An African country that has oil and gas, do like Norway. Export as much as you can, because one day nobody will buy it, and then use the money to transform your economy in a green way. So this is number one. And on that pillar, we help technical assistance to African governments to do all those right reforms, to attract private sector capital as well. And then second, when you do all your reforms, you do your planning, you'll identify a list of projects. Some of those projects will be 100% funded by government because you cannot make decent returns out of it. Number 2, you have some projects, private sector will 100% finance it without any involvement of government, without any guarantees or anything. And then you have in between the PPPs where the government has a certain role, and sometimes the government puts its money next to the private sector. And for that, you need development capital for the private sector money, the private sector project and the PPPs, because the development capital is costly. If you're doing, for example, a hydro project that Norway is so good about, you need a lot of money to develop it. And you're not 100% sure that project will become bankable, and that the government at the end will sign everything, and you'll raise the money, execute, get your money back over 25, 30, sometimes even 40 years. Since that money is expensive because of the risk involved, our alliance is raising the $400 million blended finance, so grant, senior equity, junior equity, that we will co-invest next to private developer. Since the Minister of Norway is here, let me take Scatec. Is a great developer in renewable energies, for example. They may say putting $30 million in Madagascar or in one country on one project is too much. We can say, let's put 10 million next to you, or 15 million, you put your 15 million, and together we develop the project, and at financial close, our fund will exit the project and let long-term equity investors who are risk-averse to come and replace our capital. We take back our money with return, and we reinvest in other projects. And once you develop project, you need now equity investors, sovereign wealth funds, you need MDBs, commercial banks, maybe guarantee providers like the AFDB, the MIGA, whatever, to structure it. Let's say it's a $2 billion project. The equity investor will put in 400 million, and let's say the rest is debt and guarantees to reach financial close. And the government will not borrow on that transaction because it is funded by the private sector. Governments are indebted in Africa, debt distress. So on projects that are for the whole world, renewable energy, climate adaptation, we shouldn't be borrowing more to finance those projects. We need worst case scenario, concessional money, best case scenario, grant money. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And I very much, just want to underline this, that these new ideas of innovative financing, blended financing, and reducing the risk of cost of capital is really essential. We work, you do, and we also work much on that now, that we as a government donor, sometimes our money is best spent in securing private investments, which means there's a risk of currency fluctuation, which happens a lot in countries which are dependent on certain commodities, much more in sort of more broadly based economies, political risk, regulatory risk. And if you combine that with an assistance also to regulatory reform, for instance, green energy, when you have it, is actually less expensive than fossil energy. It's just you have to get it, you have to invest and build it first. But when you have it, you will see the unit cost goes towards zero because, the sun is free, wind is free. Just when you have the windmill in the fall. That's very good news for developing countries. You don't have to spend your hardly earned foreign capital on importing. So important, but you need to get there. And why don't you get there if this makes sense? Well, because the private investors are uncertain about, whether this will be politically stable or whatever it is. And that's where we can come in. So I think so donors are increasingly thinking about how can we ensure that smart private investments happens in Ghana, which would have happened in Sweden or Norway naturally because we don't have these risks. So this is really a frontline development, and it's very connected to, between the theme of human development and the theme of climate change. It's a very good connection. I unfortunately have to run.
This is what I see, and I would certainly not infuriate your close team, and I see that
my team is getting increasingly nervous.
That's what I see. So you will not have the time to exchange styles. I'm sorry. We'll need to bring you back on a panel. Thank you very much, Foreign Minister, and all the best in the upcoming negotiations. It would seem that Saber Chowdhury is also still, I did not check the telephone, but trapped in negotiations. But I must say very selfishly that I would never have dreamt of having the panel just with you. So we will be able to deep dive into questions, and there will be no way to escape. I guess I would also like to take questions from the audience, perhaps if there are already some questions. So we keep this as interactive as possible. And if there are questions online already, no, okay. Yes, please, the gentleman, if you can be so kind as to briefly introduce yourself. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. My name is Ian Hitchcock. I'm a master's student of public policy at Duke University from the United States. You may get into this later, but when we talk about the investment in places like Africa, I feel like it's sometimes difficult to avoid the shadow of colonialism and the concerns that, for instance, some communities have with the World Bank being the entity that's dealing with loss and damage. So I'm wondering, from your position in trying to leverage finance from a variety of sources, to what degree do you consider or have to reckon with kind of past legacies of exploitive relationships and how that factors in?
You know, I think, frankly, today in Africa, you know, people, I think in most of the countries, no longer have, I think, that complex of on past relations, Francophone countries, you know, having to deal only with France or French investors and Anglophone and so on and so forth. You see a country like Senegal, when I was a minister, we attracted investments and financing for government from around the world, from Asia, from UK. UK, for example, was a big contributor in Senegal, despite being a Francophone country. We don't see it as a major problem. However, what I would like to emphasize on is the need, for example, for this loss and damage, if it's going to be housed at the World Bank. What we just need is to make sure that the processes, the procedures are flexible enough, are transparent enough, and are not too complex for vulnerable countries. Because the loss and damage fund is mostly for vulnerable countries, vulnerable to effect of climate change, and most of them are poor countries. And most of them have capacity building issues. That's a major problem in Africa, in many countries, wherein within government, you don't have the enough skills to really go through all those complex processes to attract money from all those funds. If you look at the GCF, for example, you know, many African governments complaining that they're not getting enough resources from it. You have more advanced countries in Latin America or maybe in North Africa, maybe, that are getting more from those type of funds because of the complexity. And I'm just truly hoping that for that loss and damage fund, it will be very simple so that a country like Guinea-Bissau or anyone in Sierra Leone can have access effectively to mitigate, to adapt to climate change. Yeah.
I'd like to somehow follow up on that. Listening really carefully at the description you were giving of the work of the alliance, it seems that Europe actually has a lot to learn from what is going on and the methodology and the way you work together. Is this what you...
Yeah, I think Europe is already doing quite well in terms of cooperating among the development finance institutions of Europe. For example, the EIB and the EBRDs and the AFDs, they work quite well, you know, I think together. And the European Union itself also has tools that can really support many of these European countries when they need it. But what we want to see actually is really more support for Africa, not only to de-risk and mobilize private sector projects, private sector investors, but to have concessional money for Africa when we have to borrow. I'll give you just one statistics. Today, there is what we call the Africa premium on the capital markets. An African country that has the same rating as a country that is in Latin America or in Asia, for example, that African country that has the same rating pays sometime up to 500 basis points more when we issue Eurobonds on Eurobond markets, right? And 500 basis points is 5% on a $1 billion transaction for 20 years. It's a lot of schools and universities and roads that you can build in Africa. So we need a partnership with Europe, with everyone, to make sure that the Africa risk premium is reduced drastically if we cannot eliminate it. But it's there and it's costing us a lot of money.
Those development projects, as President Adesina, President of the African Development Bank, stressed, this is the opportunity of the century, not just for Africans in Africa, but for the entire world. The question is, how do you measure the return on investment for citizens? So in other words, how can you ensure that of all those infrastructure development projects, the jobs created are local jobs?
You know, when you're building an infrastructure project lasting, let's say, 3 years during construction, at the end of the construction, those jobs are no more jobs locally. So what you need to do is, while we are building those infrastructure projects, is to train the African people. That's why we are emphasizing in some countries to have more vocational training, more engineers, more technicians, so that tomorrow they can go export their skills into other countries. Luckily today, many companies that win contracts in Africa no longer import a lot of workers into Africa. Most of the countries now have a decent level of workers that you can train and then sort of use them in other projects, even outside your own country. What's important is to make sure that those infrastructure projects are not just for prestige, that they're helping people move goods, for example, or move themselves from one area to another area and help make our economies more competitive. If it's electricity, we have to make sure that the tariff that is coming out of those projects is, one, affordable for the people, and number two, is good for our companies as well to be competitive. If you're an industry, you're paying twice more electricity than a company, your competitor based in Asia or somewhere else, it's very likely that you're not going to go anywhere far. So policymakers and partners who can provide concessional money can help us really bring down those costs of electricity, which is one of the biggest criteria. And then third, maybe I'll stop there on this question, is transforming locally our green minerals. So far, everything is exported, virtually zero transformation, zero today. Things are exported from DRC, from Zambia, from Zimbabwe, from other places, and zero transformation. That is really not the good way to create wealth and improve the lives of people. We have to work with partners. Some partners like Germany, for example, announced at the Paris summit in June, the Macron summit, that they're willing to work with African governments that have mineral resources to add some value to it on African soils before starting to export, and we need to seize that opportunity. It's like exporting gas with LNG instead of exporting petrochemicals, fertilizers, and things like that. And that is the best way, if we could do that, to generate wealth and improve significantly the lives of people, but also to work on governance. That's a very important issue as well. Governance, to make sure that when a project is started, it finishes on time, on budget, and the right projects is built also at the right place, not necessarily for prestige or for political reasons.
In that case, Europe can definitely take lessons from you, I'm sure. There's a very important point you stressed, the training of the workforce. But the question is, what about cross-border mobility? I know it's a challenge. In Europe, at some point, legally you can, but some say, sorry, I live in Munich, I will not move to the other side of the country, let alone another country. But in Africa, it's even difficult legally speaking.
I mean, within Africa, it's been difficult, even if some countries have made good progress by sort of eliminating visa requirements for Africans moving across Africa. Senegal is part of them. Actually, for Senegal, anybody can go to Senegal without a visa anyway. But within Africa, a few countries have started to do that to allow Africans to move within Africa. But the mobility also between Europe and Africa and let's say the United States, I think should be encouraged, but both ways. It shouldn't be only Africans, going to Europe. We have to make sure some competent people in Europe, young people, less young people, can move to Africa, work with Africans, help train, cross-fertilize ideas and experiences and expertise. But for us, we need to train much more young people, because every year we have about 20 million people coming on the job market, and the majority doesn't have any skills. Many drop outs. So we need to train more so that these policies of voluntary immigration, chosen immigration that some European countries want to put in place is not to the detriment of Africa. Because if we train few doctors, few engineers, and European countries hire them through some programs, then we will not have enough people also to develop our own economies. But since we have many young people, by 2050, 1 out of 4, by 2030, 1 out of 4 young people will be in Africa. So if we train them massively, if half of them go somewhere else outside the continent, we don't mind. But if you train 10% of them and then all the 90% of those goes to Europe, then we're gonna just remain where we are.
I referred earlier to the background of Minister Eide because he held the position of defense minister, environment minister, twice foreign minister, and so that gave him kind of a holistic approach. You were Minister of Economy, but also planning and international development, and you referred to governance. The portfolio you have is a vision in itself. It's a vision for the world, but especially for African youth. So you can project yourself in the future. Would you say that there has been a lack of vision from political leaders?
I wouldn't say that. The vision is there most of the time. The ambition is set, but the implementation has been a major issue. And one fundamental issue has been lack of capacity within government. I mean, when I became minister, within 2 months, we secure a facility from a foundation. I can tell the name. It's a MasterCard Foundation from Toronto. They gave us a facility so that for 5 years, we can hire people from the private sector and pay them private sector salaries to come in my cabinet in some department of the ministry and to really deliver for Senegal. And we paid them not using any public money. All that was from a partner philanthropy. If we can find some facilities like this, where African governments would need really the capacity to have in key ministries 2, 3, 4, 5 people who can really help drive the agenda, to interact with development partners in a very credible way, to interact with the private sector, to really also help organize all the other ministries to really drive reforms. For example, we did our PPP, massive PPP reforms. At the time, it was said this is the biggest reform the country has ever done. In 6 months instead of 4 years. Because I had hired somebody from the IFC who used to be a banker at BNP Paribas, 20 years experience in project finance. I appointed him director for PPPs and financing. He had a team of young people, 12 within his office. Within 6 months, we delivered a very complex, tedious, painful reform. I had to go to cabinet 5 times. You know, our president chaired 15 hours in total of meetings with the entire cabinet before I went to cabinet. You know, I got it approved at the last cabinet meeting, then we went to parliament, it passed. Now we are doing, Senegal is doing transactions on that law. Why we were able to do that? Because we managed to attract many good people, from consultants that we hired within my office, investment bankers, engineers, and they drove it like a private entity would do. We would work on WhatsApp call, we'd work Saturday, Sunday, late night, on the move, on the plane, everywhere, like you do when you're driving a transaction that you want to close the transaction and get paid a fee at the end of the transaction like an investor or a banker. And everybody works like that. During COVID time, we did all the plans for Senegal, for the resilience plan, the economic, social resilience plan was the second best in Africa after South Africa. We raised money, $1.5 billion to finance it. All that via video calls, nobody could travel, but everybody was working via VCs, except the top 20 people of the ministry. We were all going to the office with the distances and all of that, but all the 800 people of the ministry, they stayed home working from home, except maybe 20 people. And that was delivered because people were motivated, were driven, and they knew what they wanted. And if we could have that in many countries, I think you will see the changes. And when we faced the private sector, we had sometimes a better team than the investor. So things were moving extremely fast, and all the development partners, things moving very fast. We did a project with the World Bank in 3 months instead of 18 months. 3 months, it was approved by the board of the World Bank, and we started implementing that transformational project for Senegal. And the World Bank mentioned it to the president. This is the fastest ever we could do in a country. 3 months from idea to getting the board approval of the World Bank for that massive project. So that's why I think capacity building, having the right people in government, skillful people, and finding ways to pay them properly also. You know, like some countries are doing. In Singapore, for example, they're competing with the private sector to attract talent in government. And so long as we don't do that, it's going to be very hard to do really transformative things, impactful, in a very sustainable, smart, efficient, quality control at the right cost, you know, for our governments. For me, that's the most important thing. If you have the right people in government, even if you're poor, you're going to structure things to attract investors, development partners, and people will want to also to work with you because you know what you're trying to achieve. And I think, for me, that's fundamental, and the partners can help, I think, do that.
Thank you very much for that. I think one does not hear that often. And I think it matters to also say that there are extraordinary people in government. And we have seen a bit of demagogy, if not populism, regarding the need to only, you know, pay people in government little. I think this, if I understand correctly, this has hurt the capacity and even the quality of government.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in other countries that are not able to do that. In our case, we managed to mix all those private sector-minded people with the public sector that was there, and the level went up. For example, one of my DGs in the ministry, he never used WhatsApp. He never sort of replied to his mobile. He leaves it at home or somewhere. And I tried to reach him. I couldn't reach him. And I told him, man, if you want to stay in this ministry, you got to be on WhatsApp, and you got to be available 24/7. And he's completely changed. His team completely changed, you know, and everybody, you know, running the way the leadership in the ministry wanted to run. And you know, you can ask development partners in Senegal, you know, between 19 and 22, the way the ministry, we didn't have a prime minister at the time, so our ministry was coordinating almost everything with other ministries, and we could do that because of the people. For me, the same way having good people at universities, teachers, professors, or in private sector, having good people, talent in private sector, you need to have talent in government if you want to do amazing things. Yeah.
So we have a question. If we can have the microphone. I had a question on philanthropies, but Hiba Agib, member of our board.
Yeah, thank you very much for your input, and I totally understand the power behind implementation when you have the right teams at the right place. And I want to highlight here that this is not an African challenge only or problem. We have the same challenge in Europe and other countries to get the transformation done. To have the right people dealing with the transformation, with climate, with societal aspects, the way we deal with business and with the energy of change and inspiration that we would do there. So I think there's a lot to be done in exchange here. And also, in terms of the question that we always, and here I'm wearing now the African hat as an Egyptian, with the investability and de-risking and etc. I think there's an important element to asking the question the other way around. How much would it cost if we don't invest in Africa or the Global South? How much would it cost the businesses in Europe and in the US and rest of the world if we don't do the right investments today? And this would take us to another way to answer the questions. And I would be really interested in further conversations to look at the projects and the plan of financing that you have and how to push forward the implementation instead of theoretically talking about risk and de-risk, because I think we're over this conversation. We know that we all are in risk if we don't do it, right? So thank you for your input.
I mean, you're definitely very right on that, and being practical is always important. That's why also for foundations, concentrating on a few countries, putting more resources in the right countries and showing the results could be actually something really amazing. And instead of, you know, talking to 54 countries, spreading it, and sometimes you don't get the results. You choose 2 countries in Africa, you invest massively your philanthropy money to unlock massively reforms, private sector investment, and show that this country made it because of our investments. I think that would be very interesting.
Hi, my name is Samar, and I'm just curious if you can maybe share some reflections about the gender angle of this. How can we have a just climate transition? There was no mention at all in this discussion so far about women. And I think that they should actually be an integral part of even designing the L&D fund, which has not, it doesn't look very promising with the pictures we've seen and the numbers of men. The representation of women in leadership is obviously very low at the moment. So would love to hear your thoughts on this.
You're definitely right. On our Alliance for Green Infrastructure, the money that we are investing, the gender issue, the gender marker, is at the heart of it, and it is even a condition for some countries and even for some investors to put their money in it. And at the African Development Bank and Africa 50, who is the fund manager, the gender policies that we have on all projects that the bank is financing in Africa, number one, women working on the project for the execution. How many of them, what percentage is critical? But more importantly, who are the beneficiaries of that project? For example, is it 50%? Is it 55% women? This is something that the bank is measuring, and our shareholders, Africans and non-African shareholders, they take that very seriously. So really at the fund, it's at the heart of what we do. But I'm very hopeful that for the future as well, the years to come, I think we'll see many more women in leadership in these issues. Why? Because we see it in Senegal, women graduating in engineering, in math, in science, is now much more than men graduating. The baccalaureate in Senegal, at least 55% now is women and only 45%, especially the baccalaureate of science. And I think that is really something very, very promising, and it's gonna be just fantastic. You know, my daughter, she's graduating next year. She's major in economics and minor in computer science, and alhamdulillah, and she's much, much smarter than really, and I see the grade that she's having. I never dreamed to have those grades when I was a student. And my second daughter also same on the, and the boy now needs to follow those two, so. Yeah, the little one, yeah.
Thank you. I want to thank you very much for this question. The panel does not represent that. We had actually supposed meant to have more women than male on the panels. Last minute cancellations made it very difficult. That's the main reason, but I really thank you for that. It's true, we have not covered that question. Our foundation has several initiatives dedicated to advancing female leadership, so I'd be very happy to engage after the discussion. Thank you for bringing this. The gentleman in the...
Hello, my name is Niaz. I'm from Maldives, from a youth-led non-governmental organization called Maldives Space Research Organization. Why space? Why Maldives? For me, I studied environments, sustainable development, and understanding the IPCC reports, understanding the outlook for corals, being a coral nation, knowing that our economy is essentially, our livelihoods is dependent on this. What does it mean when we say economic transformation? What does it mean when we say like economic diversification? To me, it's being able to match the current output by 2030 in a meaningful way. I think the blueprint that you just highlighted on that really high talent pool, like focusing on this problem is definitely a way. I guess, how do we start making a pitch to, like, I'm just a youth, right? Like, how do I start talking to the sort of people that can, yeah.
Yeah, I think as young people, having you engaged also in politics, I think is very important. What is a pity in many countries is that people will say politics is dirty, is this and that. I'm not going in there. So you end up having many competent people who are skillful, driven, hard workers, honest people being pushed away, and young people being pushed away from the political process. And I think if you don't engage engage the youth, be in politics, get elected. It's where the decisions are made. I tried to run for mayor of my small town. I didn't win. I came second, but I'm not letting it go. One day we'll have to come back. Not necessarily at mayor level, but anyway. Having people engage in politics, young people, is extremely important. In my ministry, my chief of staff, the highest person after the minister, and with the PAMSEC, they're almost same level, was 27 years old when I appointed, 28 years old, when I appointed him chief of staff of a ministry of more than 800 people, and delivered like in a way that is unbelievable as a very young person, but competent and driven. So really, we are, asking you to engage your government. Young people should engage more with the government and possibly go into government. Yeah.
Very much. Lady in the second row.
Thank you so much. I'm Johanna from the Alliance for Financial Inclusion, and an excellent point on youth leadership. That's really brave of you as well. When we talk about a just transition and many African countries, especially, a large part of the GDPs and also the labor force is made up of micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. And a just transition, of course, it's about climate mitigation, and it's not about blaming the micro enterprises for CO2 emissions, but it's also about resilience building and adaptation. And at the same time, we see that these MSMEs have a hard time accessing credit because of the cost of capital, but also the risk that they are faced with. So what are your thoughts on this, or are there any specific measures done in Senegal that you could share with us? Thank you.
The private sector, in most African GDPs, the informal sector is 50-50 or even sometimes 60%, depending on the countries. More than 90% in some countries, or more than, let's say, 80% are involved in the informal sector. And that sector has very hard time to get credit from the banks. And often they get credit from microfinance institutions, but the cost is extremely high. Sometimes the difference between getting credit from a bank or from a microfinance institution could be as much as 1,500 basis points, meaning 15%. You go to a bank, you get 10%, microfinance, you get 25%. Why? Because the microfinance institutions have very expensive cost of capital. They mobilize resources mostly from banks, not from depositors, but from banks, and the banks pay them charge them a very expensive fee. So I think the source of funding for microfinance could be improved by government policies, but also by donor policies as well. Or multilateral development banks can lend to commercial banks and say, on lend to microfinance, but the rate is capped. So this is one. Number two, having maybe guarantee instruments from the government. Again, here, private sector alone cannot do it. You need government to mitigate the risk of microfinance institutions for them to lend more basically to the informal sector. But also digitalization, being able to identify all the actors in the informal sector in the economy in a very precise way, with a unique identification number, so that they don't go get money from this entity, default there, go somewhere else, create many companies. You have also the justice system also, sometimes that does not favor the banks or microfinance institutions. So the banks become very conservative, because sometimes even to realize, let's say, the guarantees that they receive, it could be a challenge. So having DFIs, grant money, concessional money, on lend to banks or microfinance, having government itself taking its own resources, setting up guarantee entity that can absorb some of the losses, that could be also interesting. At the African Development Bank, we are setting up what we call the Youth Entrepreneurship Investment Banks. These are investment banks sort of doing, let's say, kind of VC money, to giving VC venture capital money to entrepreneurs, giving guarantees so that they can go get loans from banks at a cheaper rate, and three, technical assistance instead of having in each country many programs where this ministry has their program, this ministry has, you put everything on one roof that serve all sectors in the economy instead of each ministry having their own thing. We approved already for Liberia, and 12 other countries will be approved next year, and more countries will sign up, and the bank will provide money to the government to co-invest with maybe a local development bank or a local fund managed by professionals that can provide the resources to young entrepreneurs, dedicated only to young entrepreneurs. Yeah.
Do we have another question from the audience, or we can move to a last question because yes, so that will be the very last one. You mentioned MasterCard which has been doing a tremendous work. It's a great foundation. What is the place for philanthropy in this infrastructure development, and what is the prospect for PPPP, public-private philanthropic partnership?
It is of a paramount importance. We cannot get there without the right use of the philanthropy resources to structure and attract a private capital and even make public investments cheaper, because the interest rate today is extremely high. You have a difference of 500 basis points as a government if I borrow 1 year ago and now, because only SOFR, the reference rate, have moved by 500 basis points, which is 5%, because the central banks in Europe and America increased rates to fight inflation. That was not caused by Africa, but we are feeling the big pain of that. It's very costly. So having philanthropy to help buy down that cost is very important. Attract private capital like we are doing in AGIA, the Alliance for Green Infrastructure in Africa. Tonight, at 5 o'clock, there is one philanthropy that will announce their pledge for the Alliance, and we are talking to others to contribute as well. And those grant resources will help absorb the first losses so that the private sector doesn't lose money early, so that the returns can be enhanced, because project development is risky. You cannot do it alone. You need philanthropy. You need grant resources.
Amadou, Hott, thank you so much. I think that everyone has understood by now that you've spent the last hour with the future president of Senegal. So great many thanks for your time, and we'll be in touch again very soon. Thank you very much, the great audience.